Now before we create our texture map for our base, let's do a little bit of cleanup. Let's Control-Tab over to the additional files that we have open and close them. So the texture and the bump map layer that we created for the ivory are now closed, and it doesn't look like we have anything else open. We want to be able to just focus on the rendered image and the bump map that we're now going to create for the base. Now the bump that we want to apply is going to add some of the detail that's missing from our geometry. Bump maps, in general, don't affect the geometry of a layer. The geometry was generated from those grayscale maps that we created earlier, but this is, in fact, real geometry. As we get around to edges, the actual shape is defined by the geometry that we created in those earlier steps. But any subsequent bump map that we apply to that layer is not going to actually affect that geometry. It's only going to affect the way the light reflects off of the surface of our object to give it the impression, and a very realistic impression, of having additional geometry there. The reason that we're using a bump map instead of actually creating geometry is what we're going to now be applying is so detailed that an actual geometric model of it would be so high resolution that it would be unwieldy to work with. So we basically rough in the rough geometry with the grayscale steps that we pursued earlier, and now the fine detail work we're going to achieve with a bump map. And if we come over and close down our adjustments panel so we can see our layers, you don't have to do that if you have a big enough screen, of course. Way down here at the bottom are the two depth maps that we created back in Chapter 2 that define the shape of the top and the bottom of our chalice. But the live link between the geometry of our chalice and these depth maps was broken when we exported and re-imported the chalice. That's one of the things that you sort of lose when you take those steps. In our case, though, it's still useful to have these around because we can use them as reference guides. If we double-click on the bottommost map here, the one that says Layer 2 Depth, you'll see that this is the original depth map that defined the shape of the base of our chalice. And we're going to use this as a reference guide of sorts to generate the bump map that we're going to use for our chalice. So I'm going to select all of these layers and merge them down. Select all and copy. Now we can just close this. We don't need it anymore. And coming over here and making sure that our base layer is selected, come over to our bump strength and choose New Texture. By default, just like elsewhere in Photoshop, it's going to look at whatever's currently in the buffer and suggest that as the sizes, and that's all just fine. It's even going to suggest 16-bit grayscale, which is also fine. Might be a little bit overkill for a bump map, but that's all right. And we can call this another name just to be able to find it really easily, and we'll call this Base Bump. And click OK. After a moment, it generates the layer, which by default is just going to be filled with white. But now if we come over and double-click on our base bump layer, we can paste in the map that we just copied. And we're only going to use this for reference. Now that I have it here, I'm going to hit Command-R, Control-R on Windows to bring up my ruler. And I'm going to drag in a couple of guides that let me know where the main bump is, which I can sort of eyeball from the lighter band that goes across. And then I'll drag a couple of other guides in that are going to allow me to sort of remember where I am in terms of generating a couple of the main bumps that we're going to create now in this map. And the first one that I want to generate is a dent that runs around the bottom of the lip that will generate what looks like more detail in the lips, a sort of stepping effect at the bottom of our model. And I'm going to do that with the brush tool. I'll come over here and choose it. We want black, definitely. The brush size of 60 that we have is probably way too big. So I'm going to take that down to probably something closer to, let's say, 5. No, that may be too small. Let's say 10. That's good. And now I'm going to move over on the left, and just underneath my guide here, I'm going to click, hold the Shift key down, and drag to the right, and let go. And that's pretty much going to follow the guide that I just created. Let's Control-Tab back over now. Once again, it's going to prompt us because it is going to auto-save that file for us, which now went from being a single layer to a multi-layered Photoshop file. Click OK. And now look down at the bottom of our render here, and you'll see this little filleted edge has now added itself to the bottom of our scene, which is just great. Nice little bit of extra detail. Looks like we've modeled it in there, but it's only a bump map. Cool. All right, let's Control-Tab back over and try something a little more sophisticated. Let's add some vertical ridges to the details that we have here. And I'm going to add these ridges on a new layer, so I'll press Command-Option-Shift-N on Mac or Control-Alt-Shift-N on Windows to create that layer first. It's worth noting, by the way, that it's not really hurting anything having this background element in here. It's so smooth that it's not really affecting our bump at all. But you may find down the road that in certain cases you want to replace any reference materials like this with just a neutral gray. In our case, however, I'm going to drag in a couple of more guides. I'm going to drag vertical guides this time, and I'm going to come in a little ways past this second vertical dark line to about there, and then just on the other side of that same bump, about the same distance in to about there. Let me drag this down. Now this time I want to add light-colored lines. Bump maps in general work the same way that topo maps do. The brighter areas are higher, and the darker areas are lower. And we definitely want to add a ridge here. So I'm going to hit the X key to swap my foreground and background colors. I have a pretty soft brush here, so I'm going to hold the Shift key down and the right bracket key to harden up our edges somewhat. Not all the way, but maybe a step back from that. I'll come up to the top, and I'm going to click. Add the Shift key, come down to right between these other two guides, and click again. Click and add the Shift key down and drag to the right to constrain to horizontal. Takes us back to snap to our other guide. And then I'll let the Shift key go, click once again, add the Shift, come up to the top, and if your screen moves a little bit like that, don't worry. It's just an auto-scroll feature in Photoshop that drives me nuts. But now that we've done this, let's Control-Tab back to our main image and see what the results are. And the results are pretty good. We now have a ridge down here that wasn't there before, which is a nice jumping off point for adding a little bit more detail. Let's Control-Tab back to our file and add some dots into the ridge to create more of a worked metal look. I'm going to hit the X key to flip our foreground and background colors, so now I have black to work with. And I'm going to reduce the size of our brush down to about 5, just hitting the left bracket. And I'm going to come over here to our brush controls and open up our brush control panel. And if you select the first option here underneath brush presets, brush tip shape, we can adjust the spacing of our brush. I'm going to drag this to about 100%, somewhere around here. Maybe even a little higher. Let's say 140. That's good. We can close our brush controls. Come up to the top, and with our new smaller dotted line brush, I'm going to click, hold the Shift key down, and following the same path that we did before, I'm going to put dots inside the white layer that we just created. Black dots in a white layer. And if we Control-Tab, back over, you'll see the results now are this wonderful beaded metallic look on the single leg of our base. So now that we know we're happy with that, let's Control-Tab back, and I'm just going to now select this layer. We get rid of our rulers. We don't need them anymore. And with Command-Option held down, that's Control-Alt on Windows, I'm going to click and then add the Shift key down to drag that layer to the left. And one more time. So I'm essentially making copies. Then once I've done those three, I'll select all of those, repeat that, and drag to the right. Shift key down again. If I need to make any little adjustments with my arrow keys, I can before I commit those changes. Control-Tab back, and you can see the beautiful beaded detail we've added to the base. This is really, really starting to look photorealistic and very, very interesting. I want to add just a little bit more bead detail to our base here, going around the edge. So let's Control-Tab over, go back and select our brush tool again. Don't really need the guides anymore, so we can come up to View and choose Clear Guides. Come down, and let's try just below the original line that we drew. Clicking, holding the Shift key down, clicking again. Let's see what that looks like. Control-Tab back. That looks pretty good. I think I want to add one just above it as well. Control-Tab over, click again, Shift key, click again, Control-Tab back. Great. I'm very happy with how the base of this looks now. Let's talk about adding an even more complex texture to the top of our chalice.